Hello everyone, we're about to make some bread. For this activity, we are going to compare the differences between bread that is baked with all-purpose flour and bread that is baked with added vital wheat gluten. So, in making bread, one of the major players in the desired outcome, that nice fluffy texture, the even crumb, nice risen dough, that happens as it's directly related to gluten. It forms, that's how the gluten is formed, because it's basically two proteins, glutenin and gliadin. And when you knead the dough and you work the dough, the gluten forms, and it's that formation that acts as, it provides the flexibility to the dough so that it can act as a balloon and expand and stretch. And the reason why it needs to stretch is because of the CO2 or carbon dioxide that's being released. And for this bread, we are using fresh yeast as our source of carbon dioxide, or our leavening agent. So what happens is the yeast metabolizes the sugars and carbohydrates in the bread as it's proofing, and it metabolizes the carbohydrates and releases carbon dioxide. Just how I'm talking right now and releasing carbon dioxide, that's what the yeast does. So we capitalize on the yeast's ability, or it's not even an ability, it's just what it does. Yeast releases CO2 as a byproduct of metabolism. So we're capitalizing on this naturally occurring process to make our dough rise. So what we should see, hopefully, and I've never actually tested it out this way with this exact formulation going head to head. So I'm interested to see the outcome. I hope you are too. Basically, what we're going to do is start with a premix of the ingredients to get a basic dough, and then add more flour as we see fit. Now, part of bread making is knowing how much flour to add. It's easy to add too little or to go overboard, and a dough that has too much flour isn't really going to rise, and it's really going to be dense. So I want to find today that proper balance between the amount of flour and the other ingredients to allow this dough balloon to stretch with the CO2 released from the yeast to form the pretty ideal texture. Also, gluten has it's described as a certain chew to it. There's like an elasticity. It's a texture that you can notice a difference. And one of the easiest ways to notice this difference is to look at a loaf of bread or a roll that is made without gluten. If you don't have the appropriate substitutes, then what could happen is that bread is very flat, it's very dense, because it doesn't aerate, because as that dough balloon stretches, it stretches from the CO2, it doesn't expand and hold its shape. It'll expand and then kind of pop and collapse back down on itself. So that is something to be aware of. And talking about the yeast, using the fresh yeast compared to the yeast packets, what I like about this is that you don't have to heat up milk first and put a little bit of the flour and sugar and the yeast together to reactivate them. This is ready to go. So what I'm going to do is take this 2-ounce package, cut it in half, and just add it right into our mixture. Okay? So, let's see, which one do I want to start off with first? Let's go with the all-purpose flour first. So we're going to add our 6.5 ounces of all-purpose flour. Then we add our 1.5 teaspoons of salt, 2 tablespoons of sugar, and then our half a block or 1 ounce of fresh yeast. And then when you open this up, I mean, you get hit with that yeast smell right away. For some people, it's off-putting. I tend to, I kind of like it. It reminds me of baking fresh bread, which is what we're doing. So I'm just going to cut up the block a little bit. As you can see, it's like it looks like clay almost, but it is crumbly. So it'll break apart and crumble up. So I'm just going to loosely incorporate those ingredients and break up the yeast. Okay, now what I have, so I have some, how much do I have? 2 tablespoons of vegetable oil. I just pour that in. And I have here, in this measuring cup, I have 4 ounces of whole milk and 4 ounces of water. So I just introduce this into the mixture. Like that. Fold these together, loosely incorporate them. So I'm just mixing it all up with the spoon just to try to, so that I don't see any white, any dry flour. But what I'm gonna take care of that. I should have a spatula somewhere. All right, perfect. I'm just gonna scrape that off. We don't want to lose any of the yeast or any of the flour, any of that good stuff. So we have that in our bowl. Set these aside right here. Now I'm going to take a mixer, set it to about medium speed, and I'm going to get the mixer going for about 3 minutes or so. So as I'm mixing, I'm trying to be aware of the consistency and make sure that all of the lumps are being broken down and incorporated. I can take my spatula here and just scrape down the sides of the bowl. Now you'll see this is a very thin consistency. Because we need to add more flour to it, of course. It looks pretty well incorporated. That's about 3 minutes, so I'm going to stop there. And I'll leave this resting here for now. Let's see if that'll actually stay. There we go. Perfect. Now we're going to do the same thing with the Vital Wheat gluten added bread. So what I have is 6.5 ounces of all-purpose flour. Vital Wheat gluten is added oftentimes in professional bakery settings, depending on the type of bread desired. So I'm adding my 2 ounces of Vital Wheat gluten to the 6.5 ounces of flour. I'm adding 1.5 teaspoons of salt. I have my 2 tablespoons of sugar. Again, my 1 ounce block of yeast. As you can see, it looks like a square of clay, and then it just crumbles. And then sometimes it even crumbles all over your table, which was not planned at all. And I'm sure you realize that. But like everything, I like to record the videos and not edit. So that's what happens. So I'm just going to use my knife to kind of cut up the yeast chunks a little bit. That was pretty funny. Okay, so we have that pretty. Oh, there's another piece. Any others hiding? We have a little bit of yeast in the oil there, but that's all okay because that oil is going into the bread dough anyway. So it's going into this mix. What I'm going to do now is take the 2 tablespoons of vegetable oil, add that in, and then in this. Oh, there's still a little bit. We've got to get all the yeast we can. Okay, so in this measuring cup, we have 4 ounces of milk, just like with the all-purpose flour bread mix. But instead of 4 ounces of water, I have 6 ounces of water, because when you add gluten, you need to have extra water. So I'll just mix that in. Move these out of the way. I'll take my spatula here and just kind of do that folding incorporation. Trying to get the dough together. Already it looks like this one's going to be thicker. Okay, so we'll take the mixer at a medium setting, again for 3 minutes. Looks about right. Just pop these off. I'll be back in 1 second. Okay, so here we have Vital Wheat gluten added dough starter or base, and then we have the all-purpose flour. Uh-oh, I found a big chunk of yeast. That was supposed to go into this one, so I'm going to just have to mix that up. Just going to incorporate that. So what I learned today is to never just squeeze a block of yeast like that so high above the bowl. Because you don't know where it's going to end up. I'm just glad I found it now while we're still putting this together as compared to after the fact when it would be just way too late. If you don't put it in at the beginning or have all the ratios of the ingredients correct when you start, you're not going to have what you want at the end, and there will be no way for you to fix it. Once it's baked, and that's it. So, I have a bag of flour that I sifted before and put it back into the flour, put it back into the bag. So this is where things get a little crazy. And I want to start with the gluten here. The lab manual says we need 13.5 to 22.5 ounces of additional flour. Now, that varies on temperature, humidity, there are all kinds of factors. So, I honestly don't even really measure. I just know that, I'll show you what I mean. So basically, we're gonna just dump in some flour. And fold it in. And what I'm doing here is trying to get it stiff enough so that I can take it out of the bowl and start to work it by hand. So as we do this, now you can see it. As I'm doing this, it's slowly turning from what you would consider a liquid, meaning that it would run right through my fingers, to something that I could pick up. Now, if your dough is still wet to the touch and sticky on your hands, then you need more flour. So we're trying to avoid that, but we want to get it going just enough so that we can work it. So what I've put in so far is maybe a cup, 1 1/4 cups. And then you can see how it's starting to become more of a mass. That I can pick up. So what I'm going to do is put some flour on our work surface. Take this out of the bowl. Now I can still feel that it's wet in certain spots. I'm going to dump out the flour here. And I'm just going to push it down. Hopefully you can see that. So I'm just going to work out the dough. Now, see how it sticks to my fingers? It's still wet over there. So what I need to do is add a little bit more. That's bordering on almost too much, but that's probably another 1/2 cup. And then I'm just going to start folding over on itself. Just over and over. And as I do this, the spots that feel wet should not feel wet anymore as I get the dry flour incorporated into the dough mass. So that's why I'm working it the way that I am. And we want to try to do this for about 3 to 5 minutes. So as I manipulate the dough, what's happening is the gluten and gliadin and the all-purpose flour are forming gluten. So I could feel that, and this one has the gluten added to it, I could feel the dough is really resisting now. So I just fold it over, make sure. So I can hold it and it's not sticky anymore. So what we do next, and I happen to have it right here, is a greased bowl that says gluten on it. I'm just going to put that off to the side for a second, and then we're going to put that in the proof box. Okay, so I'm just going to move my mess over here, and we're going to repeat the process. So I'm going to add some flour in. That's about a cup. And I'm just going to fold to incorporate. And again, that's turning the liquid into something more solid that I can actually pick up and work with my hands, like you saw with the all-purpose with the added gluten. So because this one was thinner to start, it looks like we're going to have to add more flour before I can even take it out of the bowl. It's slowly starting to incorporate, but it's still too wet to pick up. I can still see the water, the moisture. It's about half a cup. Okay, we're almost there. It's a loose dough. Let's scrape everything. Scrape that off. But see, it's sticking to my finger, so I know I need to add more flour. Put some flour down on my work surface. Move that back in frame. Then we take, it's really still too wet, so we need definitely more flour because it's sticking to my fingers. So I'm going to scrape out what's left in the bowl. If you were doing this at home, typically right now would be the time that your phone rings and whoever it is calls you like 3 or 4 times. So you have to try to clean your hands off real quick. So I'm going to put down another half cup. This. So I have my half cup of flour and I'm just trying to incorporate it again. So fold it over, put more flour on top. And I'm just working it in with my fingers. Then I fold it over. Press it down, and then I can put more flour on top again. If you like fresh breads, then you're going to start to be really excited about the aromas that you're getting off of your work surface as you're working this dough. So again, see how it's still sticking a little bit? We need to add a little bit more flour to it. Yeah, this is a little too sticky. Just a little bit more. I think that'll do the trick for us. And again, you just want to work the dough to get the gluten to form, and that's what allows this dough to stretch as the yeast enjoys the meal that we provided for them inside the food, inside the bread. So you're feeding a microorganism what it needs in order for you to be able to get what you need. In this case, it's having bread instead of a solid lump of dough that doesn't rise. All right, so that's pretty good, I'd say. We have our dough in our bowl that's marked all-purpose flour. Now, what I'm going to do is cover both of these, and after I cover it, then I'm going to clean up all the flour that got everywhere. So I just cover the bowl. Same thing for the vital gluten. Just get that saran wrap over, cover the bowl, or plastic cling wrap, if you will. Okay, so now I have my 2 bowls, and they're ready to go into the proof box. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll talk a little bit about what a proof box is. I'll be right back. Our dough mixes are in the proof box now. We have the all-purpose flour, and then the all-purpose flour with 2 ounces of vital wheat gluten added to the mix. So why do we need this thing? Basically, a proofer, or the process of proofing, is when you have an environment that is the ideal temperature and humidity for yeast. It's like sending the yeast on a spa day, or similar to how you feel if you sat in a steam room. You know, it's basically 95 to 100 degrees with a high humidity. Makes the yeast feel good. They metabolize the carbohydrates in the sugar and the flour itself, the actual carbohydrates. So it helps expedite the release of CO2. So what happens is our dough should just about double in size in the 30 minutes, and then we take the dough back out, we punch it down, form it into a loaf shape, put it in the loaf pan, and then we put it back in the proofer for another few minutes, and then it goes on to final baking. So proofing, again, is just an added step that allows the yeast to fully produce the CO2 that's needed to leaven the bread. Now, if you were not going to bake the bread immediately after proofing, we would need to put the dough into the refrigerator to slow down that process, to slow down the metabolism of the yeast. Otherwise, too much CO2 could be produced, and you can overproof, and the dough could actually blow out, like the air could blow out the side, and then it would collapse on itself, and you would end up again with a very dense textured dough, which for bread, that's not something that you want. That's not desirable. So again, it's important to know why and what's happening when you proof dough. And if you were not going to bake the bread right away, it's important to know that you would need to refrigerate the dough to slow the yeast down so that they're not metabolizing at such a high rate and releasing as much CO2. Okay? We'll check back in about 30 minutes to see how our proofing of the dough worked out. See you in a little bit. So we have the extra gluten flour, or extra gluten added to all-purpose flour. I'd say this just about doubled in size. So what we do is just put it down on the cutting board, and we're just gonna dock it or knock the air out of it so that the yeast can work again. And I'm also trying to form roughly a rectangular surface of uniform thickness. And then I'm going to roll the dough tightly on itself and then tuck the ends underneath. And I have greased loaf pan here. So I put the dough, the extra gluten dough, in this greased loaf pan. And then I'm going to repeat the same process for the all-purpose dough. Again, we're just going to dump it out onto our work surface. Cover, back in the proofer for 15 minutes, and then it's off to the oven. So we'll check in again in a few minutes. So here's the gluten loaf. I'd say it almost doubled in size again. And here's the loaf of just all-purpose without the extra gluten. I should have rolled these better, but that's what we're working with right now. So here they are. The gluten one is a little bit bigger. And then I'm going to put these in the oven, 400 degrees for about 35 minutes. Okay, so we have our loaves of bread out of the oven. They've had time to cool a little bit so I can handle them. Here we have the vital wheat gluten added to all-purpose flour. And here we have just the all-purpose flour. They went into the oven with the gluten looking a little bit larger than the all-purpose, and it looks like they kept the same size difference. So this one seems a little bit bigger. But let's cut inside. Seems like it's fully cooked inside. Let's see. Let's cut inside and take a look. We have our 2 loaves of bread. Again, this is the one that has extra gluten. This is the one that's just all-purpose flour. And feeling them, it could just be just because this one is a little bit smaller, but it has a crunchier texture. But the internal structure of the gluten one definitely seems to be a little more spongy. What we're looking at here is the high gluten is on the left side that I'm pointing at right now, and the all-purpose flour only is on the right where I'm pointing to right now. And I'm going to try to zoom in on the texture. That's all-purpose with gluten added. And here is just all-purpose. So the test is to take a bite of each. So we can compare So in looking at the texture, the all-purpose seems to be a little bit more dense, where the added gluten seems to have a little bit more aeration. So here we go with the gluten. It has a nice chew to it. The crust has a little bit of a bite. You have to tear through it. It's a nice snap. So now on to the all-purpose. The crust on the all-purpose is crunchier. Again, that just could be due to the dough size being a little bit smaller, that it cooked a little bit further. It's almost tough to evaluate. This seems to flake, whereas the gluten, it'll pull and then tear. So okay, I can tell you what it is. It's also weird to watch someone chew on video, I'm sure. So, especially after eating one after the other, the all-purpose feels lighter. It's lighter to bite through. It just feels like a lighter bread. The gluten is chewier. So you could even see when you push on it, it gives a little bit more. Where this, I'm starting to tear it, kind of. So the gluten has the ability to resist those forces. So I would say adding the gluten makes it a chewier product.